If you've ever looked at muscle car specs from the 1960s and early 1970s, you've probably seen some insane horsepower numbers. Cars like the Dodge Charger, Chevy Chevelle, or Pontiac GTO were supposedly making 425, 450, even 500 horsepower straight from the factory. But here's the thing. A lot of those numbers weren't exactly telling the full truth. In fact, some cars made way more power than advertised, while others didn't come close. So today, we're breaking down why horsepower numbers lied in the muscle car era, how manufacturers gamed the system, and why those inflated or deflated numbers still confuse people today. Gross horsepower versus net horsepower. To understand why the numbers were misleading, you first need to understand how horsepower was measured back then. During the muscle car era, manufacturers used something called gross horsepower. Gross horsepower was measured with the engine on a test stand. No alternator, no power steering pump, no air cleaner, no exhaust restrictions, and sometimes even optimized ignition timing. Basically, the engine was tested in perfect lab conditions that you'd never experience in a real car. This meant the horsepower rating often looked way better on paper than what actually made it to the wheels. In reality, once the engine was installed in the car with all its accessories, real-world power could be 20 to 30% lower. By the early 1970s, the industry switched to net horsepower, which measured engines as installed with all accessories. Overnight, horsepower numbers dropped dramatically, even though the engines themselves didn't change much at first. This alone explains a huge chunk of the lies. Chevrolet. Big numbers, big asterisks. Chevrolet is one of the most famous offenders, or victims, depending on how you look at it. Take the Chevrolet Chevelle SS 454 LS6, officially rated at 450 horsepower. That's already a massive number for the early 70s, but many enthusiasts and dyno tests later suggested the LS6 was actually producing well over 500 horsepower in real-world trim. Chevy intentionally underrated the engine to avoid insurance issues and internal competition with other GM brands. At the same time, smaller block Chevys sometimes looked stronger on paper than they really were. A 350 rated at 300 horsepower might struggle to deliver that once it is installed with emissions equipment and a factory exhaust. So depending on the engine, Chevy both underreported and overreported horsepower, often strategically. Ford, conservative on paper, monsters on the street. Ford took a slightly different approach. Engines like the 428 Cobra Jet were officially rated at 335 horsepower, which sounds mild compared to GM's numbers at the time. But almost everyone who raced one knew that rating was nonsense. Real output was closer to 410 to 430 horsepower, and Ford engineers quietly admitted the number was kept low for insurance and marketing reasons. Ford also wanted their cars to dominate at the drag strip without scaring buyers or regulators. By underrating horsepower, they kept premiums lower and avoided unwanted attention, while still delivering brutal real-world performance. This is why cars like the Mustang Mach-1 or Torino Cobra often punched way above their weight when lined up against competitors. Chrysler. Honest engines, questionable ratings. Chrysler, Dodge, and Plymouth arguably built some of the nastiest engines of the era, especially with the legendary 426 Hemi. Officially rated at 425 horsepower, the Hemi was famously underrated. Independent testing showed it could easily make 500-plus horsepower, even in factory trim. The Hemi's rating was intentionally capped, partly because Chrysler didn't want to admit just how dominant it was, and partly because racing organizations were already nervous about it. Meanwhile, engines like the 446 pack were rated at 390 horsepower, but again, real-world output was often much higher. Chrysler's engines were brutally efficient, and their ratings often failed to reflect that, sometimes on purpose, sometimes because gross horsepower testing simply couldn't tell the full story. Pontiac, playing the corporate game. Pontiac was stuck in a unique situation. General Motors had internal rules limiting engine displacement and horsepower across brands. To work around this, Pontiac often used creative ratings. The Ram Air 400, rated at 370 horsepower, was widely known to produce far more. Pontiac engineers focused on airflow, camshafts, and cylinder heads, resulting in engines that performed far better than the numbers suggested. Pontiac wasn't allowed to openly compete with Chevrolet's top engines, so they quietly built motors that were stronger than advertised, letting real-world performance do the talking. Insurance companies and government pressure. Another massive reason horsepower numbers lied had nothing to do with engineering. It was money and regulation. By the late 1960s, insurance companies began using horsepower ratings to determine premiums. High horsepower meant insane insurance costs, especially for young buyers. Manufacturers quickly realized that lowering advertised horsepower could make cars more affordable to insure, even if performance stayed the same. At the same time, government emissions regulations were looming. Automakers started softening numbers early to prepare for stricter rules and avoid scrutiny. Horsepower ratings became a marketing tool, not a scientific measurement. The 1971 to 1972 horsepower collapse. One of the biggest myths in car history is that muscle cars suddenly became weak overnight. In 1972, horsepower ratings across the board plummeted, but this was mostly due to the switch from gross to net horsepower, not instant mechanical neutering. A car rated at 425 horsepower in 1971 might be rated at 280 horsepower in 1972, even if it made nearly the same power at the crank. While emissions controls and lower compression did eventually kill muscle car performance, the numbers fell much faster than the engines actually did, confusing generations of enthusiasts. Why it still matters today? These misleading horsepower numbers still affect car culture today. Prices, reputations, and comparisons are often based on factory ratings that don't tell the full story. Two cars from the same year with wildly different horsepower numbers might actually perform almost identically. Meanwhile, some low-horsepower muscle cars are absolute monsters once properly understood. Knowing this history helps explain why muscle cars earned their legend, not because of the numbers on paper, but because of how brutally fast they were in the real world. So next time you see a muscle car spec sheet from the 60s or early 70s, take those horsepower numbers with a grain of salt. Whether they were inflated, underrated, or just measured under unrealistic conditions, they rarely told the full story. The real muscle car era wasn't about numbers. It was about torque, attitude, and domination on the street and strip. And that's exactly why these cars are still talked about today.